can write this down as an optimization problem, and life is almost good. And there's also this whole what I call the loss function zoo. There are many loss functions. I've just listed 4 here. It turns out the perceptron algorithm, not the online version, but the batch version of the perceptron, where you iterate over the training data multiple times. That is actually stochastic subgradient descent for that particular loss function. So you plug that into that expression on top, and for perceptron, remember there was no regularizer. And SVM, which we saw quite a bit, and some of you, or hopefully all of you, implemented, is an instance uses something called a hinge loss. The AdaBoost algorithm, which we saw earlier, and I didn't introduce AdaBoost this way, but AdaBoost minimizes exponential loss. We look at logistic regression most likely next week, and it turns out that minimizes logistic loss. And while I'm just throwing a bunch of equations on the board, but the ideal loss that you want to minimize for classification is the error, the 0-1 loss. If you make an error, you lose a point. If you're correct, you lose nothing. Unfortunately, minimizing 0-1 loss is NP hard, so we need to live with these surrogates. And then there's the question of what is the best loss function to use. If there are so many loss functions, what do I use? And answer there ends up being something between pragmatic and mildly religious. Pragmatic because if you have the code for SVM lying around, you'll use SVM. If you have some implementation of logistic regression, you'll use it. The religious version of the story is if you truly believe that the best solution to life is maximizing the margin and nothing else, what do you use? Which of these maximizes the margin?
Whichever one you have installed.
No. Let's say you have all of them installed and you want to maximize the margin. SVM. So if you truly believe that the answer to life is maximizing margin, then you'll use SVM. If you truly believe that you care about getting a probability out of your model, then you'll use logistic regression. But in practice, at least empirically, in most cases that I've observed, the differences between these things are rather small. So you can be pragmatic about it. And in fact, you occasionally see papers that say we've used machine learning in this problem and we compared 4 different learning algorithms. It turns out they're just making minor tweaks to loss functions. They are basically comparing the same algorithm with small changes. So again, in practice, all these algorithms, which are if they are well tuned and if the regularizer is set properly and if the features are selected well, they'll roughly perform the same. Questions? Okay, then I'll ask you a question. Well, for those of you who came late, that's not a question, but for those of you who came late, no office hours tomorrow because I'm traveling. There's an intermediate project report due tonight by midnight, and you don't have to wait till midnight. If you have it now, you can submit it. And the midterm solutions will show up on the website later today. I encourage you to take a look at it, and even if you've not solved a certain problem, and even if you feel that this is boring, it's probably useful to see what the solution looks like. Okay, so let's get back to where we were. We looked at learning as loss minimization. And I talked about and the statement I said was, if your model is well tuned, if your classifier has all the hyperparameters selected carefully, and you have the best set of features, and if you're using SVM or perceptron, if you have the best kernel, the right kernel, then all these things will perform roughly the same. So the question is obviously the following. Choosing the model involves not just finding the weight vector, but doing all those other things. Finding a feature set, finding the best hyperparameters, defining a loss function, and all those things. And if you notice, all the learning algorithms we looked at focus on this last bit of them. Because the last bit is well studied, you get these nice convex problems, and it makes for good lectures, entertaining ones. But the fact is, if you're going to implement all these things in practice, and if you want to use machine learning in your application, you need to figure out all those other things. Choosing features involves domain expertise. If at least one version of the story is coming up with a good feature representation requires you to know about your domain. It requires you to be or at least have in your team an expert on, I don't know, whatever your task is. But let's say the expert comes up with 18 different options, 18 different sets of features. But even then you need to figure out what's the best one. And you only have a training set to figure it out. And even if you have a single feature set that you believe is the best, you need to find all these hyperparameters. C and for SVM, the learning rate, and if you have a decision tree, you might decide to prune the decision tree to a certain depth and such things. So the question is, how do you do that? So far we've not looked at any learning algorithms which figures out the hyperparameters. The learning algorithm only learns a weight vector or a tree. In the case of nearest neighbors, it learns nothing, but yeah, sure. So the question is, how do you figure out the rest? And this is a bit of a, this is where we go from solid math to something like an art. And I'm not going to exhaustively talk about ideas here, and only in particular I'm going to talk about one that you will use in your homework if you've not already implemented, which is cross-validation. There are many approaches out there, and I'm just going to briefly talk about the ones that I've listed and talk mostly about cross-validation. Minimum description length is an idea that says, let's say you try to describe your weight vector or describe your model. Model is a function, and let's say you encode your model as in some uniform, in some consistent scheme. Let's say you encode your model as a program. Minimum description length says, I like models that correspond to shorter programs. And we've seen something like this before. VC dimension says, I like less complex models. So there is a bias that guides you towards choosing models and possibly also hyperparameters. There are other criteria like AIC, BIC. Those of you who are taking the data mining class might see this if it shows up. But one thing that is almost mandatory in terms of at least something that you absolutely should know and have code for is cross-validation. Because cross-validation is something that's such an easy idea, and doing cross-validation helps you not cheat. And what do I mean by cheating? So we want to train a classifier given a data set, and we want to evaluate it on future examples. Typically, we don't have a consistent set of future examples, so we approximate it using a test set. So we train using a training set and evaluate how good the model is on a test set. In theory, I could do the following. I pick a value of a hyperparameter, let's say C for SVM, train on the entire training set, evaluate it on the test set. Then I change C, train on the training set, evaluate it on the test set. And then I pick the C that gives me best test set performance and say that is the best one out there. Does anyone see anything wrong with that?
You're essentially using your test set as a training set.
Exactly. You are fitting your hyperparameters to your test set. But
By test set, do you mean one of the K4s?
no, this is a completely separate held out collection of examples which are supposed to represent in theory the idea of future examples drawn from the distribution. And evaluating, fitting the hyperparameters or all the features or whatever on the test set is basically like peeking into the future, which at least I can't do. So the other option is somehow use the training set and only the training set to figure out both the model and the hyperparameters. Okay, and cross-validation is an answer to this question. And most of what I'm going to talk about today, many of you would have seen in some form or another. I just want to condense all this information into one place. So the general idea is the following. You're given a training set, and I like to draw a big box to represent a sequence. And you split your training set into k parts. Typically k is 5 or 10, and you call this 5-fold or 10-fold cross-validation, in general k-fold cross-validation. So you split it into k parts, and you care about evaluating the quality of one hyperparameter, or one assignment to the hyperparameters, or one feature set, or something like that. Something that is not optimized by your learning algorithm. So what you do is you take out one part, call it the validation set, in this case part 5, you train on everything else, you evaluate on the last one, and you measure the accuracy. It doesn't have to be accuracy, it could be any measure of quality that you have. So you measure, so what you have is, and we've seen something like this before, probably very early in the semester when we talked about having a validation set. So part 5 is your validation set here, so you evaluate your model that's trained on parts 1 through 4. But who said part 5 is special, so you can do the same thing on all the other parts. So train on parts 1, 2, 3 and 5, evaluate on 4. So you get accuracy that's on 4. And you do this one for each fold. So you get, in this case, k accuracy, so k measures of performance. You take the average, and that is called the cross-validation accuracy. So you measure the average cross-validation accuracy, and this number represents the quality of that particular feature set or that particular hyperparameter. And you repeat this process for every hyperparameter that you want to try. Questions? One of you. Go ahead.
If my number of epoch is more than 1,
This has nothing to do with the epoch,
I
right?
know.
Yes.
So going back to the example, the slide before this one, if I have to go through the batch training,
Right.
so for the first line,
Uh-huh.
I apply it like if epoch is 5,
This one?
5 times.
Here?
Yeah.
You,
I'm talking about shuffling. Like if there is,
as far as you're concerned, you take parts 1 through 4 and just merge it, and your learning algorithm is a black box. You give it to the learning algorithm, it does whatever it does. It does. You have to shuffle, you have to do everything you do, but basically, cross-validation is a meta algorithm. It takes as a parameter some learning algorithm.
Is there any reason that, when you were showing how you just do it on each part,
Mhm.
is there any reason that you don't, that you keep the partitions instead of choosing new partitions each time?
So there are a couple of reasons. One way of, I have seen both actually. One version could be you just randomly sample 80% of the data and test on 20% or something like that. What happens is this relates to the bias of the estimator, of the accuracy. So if you randomly sample the training set, let's say 80%, and you do it twice, there's going to be a big overlap. Even in this case, there's going to be a big overlap, but by in general, this is considered to be better. And I can derive it, but I don't want to. This is also computationally a little bit easier because what you can do as a procedural thing, what you can do is keep the same splits of data for every hyperparameter that you want to try, and then you can actually do things like error analysis on the entire training set, possibly. You have?
Why do you actually average the accuracies and not take the maximum of it?
Why is because this is an S. Think of it this way. Later, after I finish this, I'll be talking about bias and variance. The average accuracy here is an estimator of the accuracy of this model on if k increases, for example. If you have tons of data, in general, the average is a better estimate. The mean is a better estimate of.
But if you get one of the accuracies which is very less, then it will reduce the average considerably. Instead, if you take the maximum, then
Do you really want the maximum? Because think about it this way: if let's say, let's take that setting. Suppose you have let's say accuracy on part 5 on the first line there is pretty bad. What that means is you trained on the first 4 parts. Part 5 was not even part of the training set. So effectively, these are uniform subsamples of the data. So it's possible that this particular configuration, there exists a training set for which this particular hyperparameter configuration will do pretty badly. So, and you want to penalize this hyperparameter for that. So it has to influence the final accuracy.
So back to the question with the epochs, and if we have some sort of randomness or shuffling, doesn't that mean if we run our cross-validation multiple times that we can get different hyperparameters as results?
Typically not. Typically the average is more stable. In general, averages are more stable. That's the reason why you basically take the average, so that you don't you're not susceptible to the random changes. Yes.
This math requires the training sample to be like distributed, select.
No assumptions about the training set. There's we are playing the same game that we played so far. As far as the learning algorithm goes, it's a black box. It could be anything, but there is a subtle point here. And let's say you have a training set which is with 100 examples, and let's say you have 90 positives and 10 negatives. Suppose you take a sample like this. It's possible that all 10 will show up in part 5. Let's say you have 99 examples, 99 positives and 1 negative. With high probability, the training data will never have a positive. So the answer to that is called stratified sampling, where you try to sample by keeping the relative frequencies of each class the same in each fold, in each part. That's a bit of that's a slightly more complicated thing in terms of code, but it's not terribly hard. You write it once and you can, if you have designed your software well enough, you can just use it any number of times.
So when you do stratified sampling, right? So should we take the proportions by labels or features? Let's say like if I have
Take by
data
labels.
across 12 months, so should I take training data for 80%
Yeah.
of first month? 80%?
Yeah, there are many strategies here. The simplest case would be to ignore everything and hope things work out. the next simple case would be to take it by labels. But if you believe that there's some property of the data that you want to capture, maybe let's say time, then you want a representative of every piece of that in each fold. And as you can inject more and more complexity into this, and yeah, sure. You want each fold to be representative. That's what you care for, end of the day. Other questions? Okay, so what's the punchline? We care about, and like I said, there are many other strategies for model selection. In fact, feature selection is a rather messy part of machine learning, something that a lot of people don't like to talk about because it's boring. The fact is, feature selection involves trying out many different sets of features, and you could perform some sort of greedy search by having features say 1 to 10, seeing how good it is, and then adding one more feature and deciding whether to keep it or not, and then maybe throw it away, add feature 12, throw it away, keep 13, throw away 14, and build a good feature set. And it turns out greedy selection is not mathematically optimal, but the mathematically optimal version, if you try to frame it as an optimization problem, it's wildly intractable, so we are stuck doing some sort of heuristic methods. But the simple version of the story is you have some set of parameters that you want, hyperparameters that you want to evaluate, and I'm including feature sets and hyperparameters here. And we want to estimate this using only the training set and build the best possible model that we can. And the way to do this is roughly the following 3 steps. For every hyperparameter, you try to get the cross-validation accuracy. Well, not try, you do get the cross-validation accuracy, and you can do it using your training set. You rank each of these using the cross-validation accuracy, take the best one. So you have at this point some feature set and maybe some set of hyperparameters. And then go back to your training set, merge all the parts, take your full training set, and retrain a model on that entire thing. And this is, experimentally, this is the right procedure to do if you want to try out new feature, anything new. And at the end of that, when you retrain your model on the full training set, that is the model that you sell. That's the model that you believe is good because you've done all this. And this is good experimental procedure, and those of you who are doing experimental projects, I very strongly encourage that you should do this. There are other tweaks to this. If you feel that your training set is so large that doing k-fold cross 5-fold cross-validation, let's say 5-fold cross-validation requires you to train on 80% of the data 5 times. So 5 calls to the learning algorithm. And then let's say you want to try out 800 different hyperparameters. That's a lot. That's way too many executions of the learning loop, and that tends to take time. But the good thing is it's trivially parallelizable. Each of these can be split across multiple machines if you want. The other option is not to take your entire training set for cross-validation. Take maybe half of it and split only half into 5 folds and do that. And there are such tricks that you can do. Any questions about this? Yes.
Is there any relation between the hyperparameters which we get after training on the full data set and on the parts?
The
close?
No. The hyperparameters are not the same as the weight vectors. The hyperparameters is, for SVM, there's only one hyperparameter, C. So you pick a hyperparameter. So it is the best hyperparameter according to cross-validation. And then you train SVM or whatever, decision trees or whatever, on the full training set. So I think the question you wanted to ask was, is there any relationship between the best parameters, the best weight vector, and the best cross-validation weight vectors? And yeah, there might be. The easy answer is if your training set is separable, then they'll probably be similar. There's no guarantee that they'll be the same because they are different training sets. Yes?
Is there some sort of general strategy for how to choose, like when we try different hyperparameters, like try one of each order of magnitude? Or
Roughly you go in orders of magnitude. But honestly speaking, it's a bit of a, it comes with experience. And it's an unfortunate and rather obfuscated truth that the more you do this, the more you know that, maybe I don't need to try hyperparameter equals 1,000,000 because in the 18 times that I've done this before for different problems, 1,000,000 has never been chosen, so might as well not do it. The other important thing that I wanted to mention is this strategy is very widely used. So if you read papers on deep learning, for example, one of the annoyances about deep learning is that there are tons of hyperparameters. SVM has 1, maybe 2. Deep learning sometimes has 12. Or because there are different levels of learning. And often the strategy that has been suggested for fitting those is doing grid search over all those 12 hyperparameters. So you try all possible combinations of 12. And at that point, it's not clear whether it's cross-validation or it's another learning algorithm because you're fitting another vector. Questions? If not, let's move to a slightly more general discussion, but this will be a little bit informal, about something called bias and variance. You'll see bias and variance anytime you read about machine learning books, read machine learning books that are typically the ones that are written by statisticians, you'll see these phrases showing up a lot. And this is another way of thinking about the kinds of errors that your classifier makes. And the idea is the following. So, first let's talk about bias. Every learning algorithm makes some assumption. Every learning strategy makes some assumptions about your model. You believe that your data is linearly separable. You believe that this is a set of features that are good enough. You believe that an 8th degree polynomial kernel is the right thing to use. I don't know why, but you might do that. You might believe that a certain decision trees of a certain depth are good enough. And each of these introduces additional knowledge effectively into your learning algorithm. And each of these has a certain bias. What's bias? It's the loss or the error of the best predictor or the best hypothesis in your set of hypotheses. Let's say you pick a hypothesis class and you try to find a hypothesis that is the best performing one on any training set if you want. That's the bias. So and we have kind of sort of seen this before, but not exactly with this one. So just to understand, so let's say your hypothesis class does not contain the target function. There's no function in your class of functions that can fit the data. What will the bias be? Will it be high or low?
Higher.
Why?
Because even in the best case, we can't separate the data. So
Yes. So even the best member of this class cannot separate the data, so the bias will be high. And effectively high bias corresponds to something that I've been calling underfitting. When bias is high, there's nothing in your class of functions that can fit the model, that can fit the data. So this is called underfitting. If bias is underfitting, obviously variance is overfitting. Well done. So variance is, again, this is somewhat informal because there are formal definitions of both these terms. And in fact, I've also linked to a paper in the class website which analyzes bias and variance for classification. Variance is a measure of how much your model depends on this specific set of training examples. Remember that your training examples are chosen randomly from the instance space. And if, for example, your training set is chosen from, you pick a set of m examples and you perfectly fit all those m examples, and it turns out it only fits those M examples and it can never generalize. What that means is, if you pick another set of M examples from your training set, that will also get overfit. So this is a measure of how much your learning algorithm overfits the data. So just as a way to think about this, remember that decision trees can fit any data, right? If you use the ID3 algorithm. Will it have high or low variance? High. Why? Because you're overfit. Yes. And in general, variance increases when your classifiers become more complex. If you use a high degree polynomial kernel, variance will be higher because you can explain more data using more complex hypotheses. So in some sense, this thought, thinking about bias and variance is another style of reasoning about learning algorithms. And if you have lots of data, if for example you're overfitting infinite data, you're done. I mean, it's not a bad thing to overfit infinite data. So if you have larger data, variance decreases. Okay? So just as an illustrative example, this example comes from Pedro Domingos, I think. Let's say we have 4 cases, and in each, the target concept that we want is at the center of these circles. And the training set, and the game that we are playing is, you pick a training set, and you find, it's like a training set and a learning algorithm, and you find a model, and that's like throwing a dart on this board. You find a point. The ideal situation where we want to be is right here, the middle, low variance and low bias. So what that means is, irrespective of which training set you pick, you'll end up very close to the target, and you'll also consistently go there. So this is low variance and low bias. On the other hand, you could have very low variance but high bias. So this means that you're always wrong, but you're kind of wrong in the same way. Irrespective of what your training set is. This is not necessarily the best place to be. The other option is high variance and high bias. You're always wrong and you're just scattered all over the place. That's how I play Dutch. And so every time you get a new sample of the training set, you might get a different model, and the model is always off from the center, off from the target. Another option is high variance but low bias, meaning right here, there is one training set for which you get the target concept, but there's no guarantee that you got that data, that particular training set. So you might, given a different training set, you might be just far off. And this is, by the way, this is just an illustrative example. Learning is not like playing dart. But do you have any questions about this? And I want you to understand this not necessarily mathematically, but at the level of a gut feeling. Yes?
I mean, this high bias and high variance thing, so we have underfitting and overfitting at the same time. How is it possible?
So for example, here's an algorithm that's high variance and high bias. I'm not going to call it a learning algorithm, but it's an algorithm. Let's say the true concept is XOR. And you try to find a linear separator for it. So bias is high because XOR cannot be represented by linear separators. And the way you try to find the linear separator is you don't look at the training set, you just pick a random weight vector. Okay, you do nothing with the training set. So that's one way of getting high variance. Another way of getting high variance is you look at the training set and you try to find a loss that, let's say your training set is not representative of the whole thing. Let's say you live in, let's say the problem is in the space of n-dimensional XOR. And your training set is highly unrepresentative, so you end up learning a different conjunction every time because it so happens that particular training set that you picked always fits works. It's a conjunction is good enough. You always end up finding a different conjunction, so it's never correct because it underfits, and it overfits that particular training set because that training set looked like it was a conjunction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, usually
Sorry?
each part of that complete data set is overfitted, not the
Yes, exactly. And that's always the case because there is no hope that we'll ever see all data. And variance is a question of how badly we overfit the specific training set that we have. Bias is about the hypothesis space. How bad is your hypothesis space? Other questions? Right, so let's just kind of summarize what we have. Your error that your classifier makes can be because of actually three reasons. It could be because your hypothesis space is biased. It could be because your learning algorithm has high variance. It could be because your data is inherently noisy. We have no control over noise, but we have some rules of thumb that can control bias and variance. High bias means both the training error and the test error is high. This means your classifier cannot represent the data. High variance means your training error is low, but your test error is high, and this is overfitting. And this idea of bias and variance comes, historically, it comes from regression. It's been studied quite extensively in the space of regression, and if you want to know everything about it, I would strongly recommend reading chapter 7 of Elements of Statistical Learning Theory. This book is available online. I've linked to it on the website, and that covers pretty much the more formal version of the story in the context of regression. And I think in around 2000 there was an extension of this idea to classification as well, using loss functions as your measure of error. So let's think about the examples that the learning algorithms that we've seen so far, and see how we can manage bias and variance. I'll go from the bottom up. We've seen support vector machines most recently, and if, for example, you have a high degree polynomial kernel, high degree polynomial kernels can fit any function as the degree gets higher. That means the answer is there, but that means that the variance is high because it can fit any training set, which is not a good thing. Higher the degree of the polynomial, lower the bias, higher the variance. SVM has this trade-off parameter called C, and C is a way of trading off underfitting and overfitting. Effectively, it's a way of trading off bias and variance. If the regularizer gets is more important in your objective, then you have low bias. You have high bias because if in the limit, if your regularizer is the only thing that's important, the weight vector that will be chosen will always be 0 because you're minimizing the norm of W. At the other extreme, if your regularizer gets no importance, you are forcing your learning algorithm to fit that particular training set. You're minimizing loss. So if that constant decides, it trades off between bias and variance. For decision trees, as the tree becomes larger, your variance becomes higher because, again, the way to think about this is your model more complex? As the tree becomes larger, the model becomes more complex, so the variance is higher. Smaller trees have lower variance but higher bias. For example, in the limit, if your tree is a single node, which always says plus, very low variance, it will always say plus. It's the same function every time. But it's got a rather high bias because it's probably going to be wrong most of the time, or a significant amount of the time. For k nearest neighbors, this is kind of interesting. If you increase k, then why does variance decrease? What happens when k is the size of the training set?
Also, well, I guess sort of, if K were one, then you have one sort of set hypothesis, and so you really, not really trying to.
No, but you have to think about different subsets of data.
So if it's K, the size of it, you're averaging everything.
You're averaging everything. You're basically predicting the most frequent label. So irrespective of, effectively, if your training set is large enough, and K is the set of the training set, you'll basically be getting the same label most of the time. So increasing K decreases variance. And one strategy to deal with bias and variance is to use ensemble methods. One reason why ensembles work very well is because they reduce variance. You combine multiple experts, each of which looks at one part of the data, hopefully taking some sort of a weighted average of them would give you a better model, better predictor than one that looks at the whole data and just makes a call. And we've already seen an example of an ensemble method, namely AdaBoost. Another example is bagging. And you'll be implementing something like this for your homework. And the point of that homework is mostly that question is mostly for you to see that using an ensemble can give you a better performance than using a single predictor. Using a committee is often, even though committees are boring, committees tend to work, at least have low variance. Whatever that means. Yes?
Can you say something about the bias in ensemble method?
Can you speak up?
Can you say something about the bias in ensemble methods? The bias?
Bias of ensemble methods. That's a bit of a tricky thing. I've seen both answers there, so I'm not entirely sure. I believe the bias is not affected too much. Empirically it tends to decrease a little bit. Oh, sorry, it tends to increase a little bit, but it's not very clear. Other questions? So let's go back, pop up one level, and look at where we are. We looked at the idea of learning as loss minimization. And the general strategy, at least conceptually, if not actually in practice, is you look at your problem, you know something about your data, you know about your domain, and you use all your expertise to write down a loss function. And a loss function is just a function that says, this is what I don't like about models. These are the kinds of things I don't want my models to do. And you write the loss function, you write down the average loss over a training set, and you frame the problem of learning as minimizing loss with a regularization thrown in. And now you understand that regularization basically, what does it do? Bias or variance? So what is, according to the story so far, up to say last class in terms of VC dimension and such things, what does the regularizer add?
Reduces overfitting.
It reduces overfitting. It improves generalization. That's bias, exactly. It reduces bias or increases bias. A regularizer is a function that penalizes complexity. It penalizes more complex models. Penalizing complexity increases bias. In the limit, if the regularizer gets all the importance, all the weight in the objective, the bias is really bad because you'll always get the same vector. It basically ignores the data set. If the regularizer is the only thing that matters, the data set is thrown away. So regularizer increases bias, and so here are the 4 or 5 different ways in which we can explain regularizers. It increases bias. It penalizes complexity. For SVMs, it is equivalent to maximizing margin. in general, it's a function that penalizes complex models. Did I say that already? Yes. There will be another interpretation of regularization from the probabilistic perspective, and we'll see that in the next class. It's effectively introducing prior knowledge about your weight vector. You can see it's possible to write down regularization as adding a prior to your probabilistic model. And we haven't talked about that yet, but starting next class, we are going to completely switch gears and talk about probabilistic models. Okay, so that's the way I presented learning as loss minimization. I was kind of exuberant about it, and I said, problem solved. We're done, and we can know. The rest of it is just engineering. But the fact is, it's really a painful thing to find hyperparameters and features and such things, and that's this art of model selection. And the one answer I'm going to give you, and there are many, many such strategies there, the one answer I'm going to suggest is to use cross-validation. And you should be very comfortable with cross-validation. And finally, we spoke about bias and variance and how, in some sense, bias and variance is looking at the same questions of models of measuring learnability. What is learning? And the bias and variance story says learning is to find a hypothesis that has low bias and low variance. It's actually to find a hypothesis class that has low bias and come up with a learning algorithm that has low variance. Does that make sense? Questions? Ask me a question. I'm going to start pointing to people. Yes.
So we want low bias and low variance in the ideal situation. Right?
Yes.
But when you're talking about ensembles, you're saying that typically, or we increase the bias, but decrease the variance. So it almost sounds like we're not.
Ensembles tend to increase the bias a little bit.
Right.
Again, that's just an empirical observation. Like I said, it's not entirely, the jury is a little bit out on that.
Right. Because it just seemed like on the ensembles, the more we have, we'll learn more.
Will you learn more? You only have the same training set, right? So, in some sense, increasing bias is equivalent to saying you're increasing you're letting the model underfit more. But increasing bias is a way of getting rid of noise. If it underfits, it's good if the data is very noisy because you don't fit the noise in the data. That's one way of talking about the same thing. Low bias hypothesis is intuitively corresponds to the idea, it's very similar to the idea of Occam's razor. I want a hypothesis space that is smaller, that is less expressive, because less is more and such good things. Okay, let's now switch gears in the last 20 something minutes to a fun topic. Now, this multi-class classification is something that many of you, it turns out, are actually using in your projects. And I'm surprised nobody asked me this question, which is, so far I've been talking about learning algorithms which can only produce a Boolean decision, yes or no, -1 + 1. But, and I've also talked about examples like spam, which are yes or no, but there are other examples like putting an email into the right folder. That's not, I don't have only 2 folders in my inbox, I wish I did. But the fact is, I can have 20 different folders. So this is the problem of multi-class classification, where we want to predict not yes or no, not a Boolean, but one of k separate categories. So we've seen many learning algorithms so far, and all of these effectively produce only one bit of output, a single bit, right? We've, all the linear classifiers that we've seen only produce a single bit. What are the two algorithms that we've seen which does not really care about how many bits of output there are, which does not produce a binary output?
Nearest neighbors.
K-nearest neighbors is one. It does not really care. What's another one?
Decision tree.
ID3.
Sorry?
ID3.
ID3. The decision tree does not really care about, it does not say anything, there's nothing inherent in k-nearest neighbors or decision trees that makes it only suited to binary classification. But then we spoke about those things, and then we talked about all these linear models, and these are the ones that are amenable to easy analysis. So we explored and analyzed all these algorithms, linear classifiers, but all of them are binary. So obviously, the natural question is, can we go past that? So in about 25 minutes, I'm going to talk about what is multi-class classification and introduce two, though I've got three here. I don't plan to cover the third one. It will be for your entertainment when you're at home. I will introduce two methods for building multi-class classifiers, constructing multi-class classifiers from the binary, any binary learning algorithm that we know. This is not all there is, and everything that I present here is almost like a historical note. The more modern multi-class classification algorithms are actually, they come from generalizations of support vector machines, it turns out. But I won't be talking about that right now, and or I won't be talking about it in today's lecture, and if there's time at the end of the semester, we'll revisit this question of multi-class classification as an extension of SVM. So, right, and there's another idea called constraint classification which does something similar. So what's multi-class classification? You have an instance, so the setup's the same. You have instances and labels. You get instances are typically seen as feature vectors, and the instances can be seen as one of k classes. If k equals 2, then it's binary classification. So typically when people say multi-class, we assume that k more than 2. And the setup is again the same in terms of training and testing. The training set is uniformly drawn from some unknown but fixed distribution. There is this mysterious oracle function that labels the data, but that oracle is now a multi-class function, and your job is to use the training set and come up with some predictor such that given the new input you have to predict the class label. And before going ahead, I just want to mention a point which is which could cause confusion. Multi-class means each input gets exactly one label, not more, not less. And there is another problem, another learning problem called multi-label classification, where every instance can get multiple labels, but that's completely different story. We'll only be talking about multi-class classification. To think about the difference between multi-class and multi-label, multi-class is like putting a file in a directory. So any file can exist only in one directory, almost. Multi-label is attaching tags to files. So you can have many, many tags to the same file. So it's a very natural question. It shows up everywhere. And for example, you might have seen questions about handwriting character detection, and it's a multi-class classification problem. You get some input, and including apparently that's a K. You get an input, and you have to predict what label, what character it is. So it's one of say 26 or something, or 36, depending on whether you have numbers or symbols. And anyway, one of a fixed set of labels. You can a popular data set for multi-class classification, also for image detection, is called the Caltech 256 or Caltech 101. There are multiple data sets for this where you're supposed to identify what's an object in that image, and you have a fixed inventory of objects. So you need to know that these two are tires, that's a duck, that's a laptop, and somebody, the person who collected the data, decided there are only 256 categories in the world, so it is 256 way classification. it shows up all over the place. Even if you're working at Google and let's say you're working at Google News, and there's some news article that shows up, and you need to put it in the right section of Google News. There are a finite set of sections. It's a multi-class classification problem. I spoke about the email thing. This is kind of a cool thing which I recently realized Honda is starting to push out into practice, is speaking to your car. And the car should be able to identify what to do, but typically, if you think about it, a car does only 200 different things. It turns on the DVD player. No, there are no DVD players. It turns on this radio, or turns off the radio, increases the air conditioning, and such things. So any input that comes in should map to one of the finite set of things the car can do. So you can frame that problem also as multi-class classification. So the point of this is to convince you that multi-class classification is everywhere, and it's also one of those problems that is widely used not just for papers and such things, but also in actual applications that we are probably using right now. So the question now is, let's get back to the thing that we were looking at, which is we know everything about binary classification, everything there is to know clearly. Effectively, we have a black box that can take a data set and produce a binary classifier. Now my question to you is, can you come up with a strategy that can use this black box as a component to produce a multi-class classifier? Yes?
So split the features and apply some of them to one black box producing one and zeros, and then combine the ones and zeros at the end.
Split the features. What does that mean?
So that, you have two black boxes, and each one of them.
So let me tell you the interface of this problem. The interface is, I'll give you a training set. The training set has an instance, which is a vector, and a single label, one of k categories. Okay? I want you to think of a strategy that you can build a classifier that takes another instance and produces one of these k labels, and use only a binary classification algorithm. A binary classification algorithm is a black box that takes a data set which is labeled with plus or minus 1 and produces a function that mimics it. So you have that black box, and I want you to somehow use this to create a multi-class classification algorithm. Yes? No, you, Dan.
In the case of sorting emails into folders, you could train a binary classifier for each of the folders so that it only recognizes that kind.
So can you expand on that? That's roughly the answer I'm looking for, but what does it mean to recognize as that kind?
So,
so what are the positive and negative?
Yeah, so it would still be a binary classification. It would give it a plus or minus as to whether or not it should go into that folder.
So a plus is if it goes into the folder,
Right.
and minus is?
That it doesn't.
It goes into any other
somebody else. Yeah.
Okay, that's a good strategy, and you are in rather good company in inventing this algorithm, because it's got a name. More importantly, it's been reinvented like so many times that nobody knows whom to give credit for. One of the first algorithms that you can think of. The general scheme is we want to predict log k bits. If you have k categories, you predict log k bits. We have an algorithm that can predict 1 bit. Somehow decompose this decision that you need to build, the final output that you need to construct, as a combination of many, many individual decisions. And there are multiple strategies here. I'll only talk about 2 of them, one versus all and all versus all. And one versus all is actually the one that you mentioned, and it goes like this. But before that, the general setting again, more to introduce symbols into this, the general setting is you're given inputs which are vectors, high dimensional, the usual thing. We don't know n, we have inputs which are in Rn. And the output is this time a label which can be one out of k categories. And our goal is to train a predictor. In other words, we want to frame answer the following question. You're given a data set, which is now pairs of examples with attached with labels, but labels are now can be more than just plus or minus. And we want a predictor that, it's the same thing, we want a predictor that has low loss on the training set and does well on all future examples. What we want from a multi-class learning algorithm is roughly what we always wanted. Generalization, we don't want underfitting or overfitting and such things. And prediction, we have to use this model that we had to compute a label for a new, previously unseen example. So let's talk about the first strategy, one versus all. One versus all makes the following fairly strong assumption, I must say, which is that every category is linearly separable from the union of all other categories. Okay? So what that means is, given a data set, you create k binary classification problems. For class k, for example, for a particular folder, you decide that you create a binary classification task where positive examples are all examples in your original data set which had the correct label, the kth label, and negative examples are all other examples. And now you know what to do with this, because this is a binary classification task. You can use any algorithm that you want. Let's say we use naive Bayes. I don't know, doesn't matter. So effectively, we learn k different weight vectors, each of which is a local expert on deciding whether the input should be assigned this label or not. Questions? Yes.
Is it fair then to think of k nearest neighbors as a collection of binary classifiers that say whether or not it belongs to this range?
Not quite. I see where you're getting, and I'll put up a picture which reminds you more of k nearest neighbors, but not exactly. There is no notion of linear separability there.
What do you do if you get an example for which the number of these weight vectors that predict that they should get it is not equal to 1?
Excellent question. Let me paraphrase the question and throw it out to the class. Let's say you've finished training. You have k experts, each of which can say whether this input should be assigned that the ith label. Wi is an expert that can say whether an input should be given label I or not. And you get a new example at test time, and let's say both W1 and W2 lay claim to this example. W1 says this should be labeled 1. W2 says this should be labeled 2. And in all cases, labeling is done as W transpose X, and you take the sign, because it's a binary classifier. Okay? Binary classifier, so you have Wi transpose, you get an input, and you take the sign. In all cases. So it's possible that you might get multiple classifiers that lay claim to an example. What would you do? Yes?
I mean, I don't know if this is a fair solution, but if you have your classifiers keep track of something, other information about the data like the margin, you could ask them, how sure are you?
Good intuition. You had an answer.
I was going to say, assign it whichever one's more common.
Whichever one is more common. But I like that.
The other one's better.
The other one's better.
That's what I was going to say.
So the prediction strategy is called winner takes all. You don't take the sign anymore. You actually take the magnitude of W dot X, find that label which has the highest score, and give it to that label. It's called this is the standard approach to predict with one versus all. Yes.
So something, I guess, trying to expand on that idea, could you use something like your epsilon deltas to see which one is more sure?
Actually, there's a fair amount of theoretical analysis of all these algorithms. One versus all actually has very little, precious little theory behind it. It seems to work in practice, but it does not necessarily, it's not necessarily theoretically well motivated. But I think where you're getting is this idea of margin. And I'm going to skip that question now because that will take us into multi-class SVM, which I promised I'll come to at the end of the semester. Yes?
Does this assume normalized data? Like if you have one feature is on the order of 1 million, the dot product will be much larger than something.
But the weight for that feature could be of the order of 1 over 1 million. But actually normalization is not all that, there's still a problem with normalization, and I'll tell you about it. But before that, a question, what's the dimensionality of each WI? This should give you a hint. I'm taking a dot. Yes.
It's the same dimensionality as your x's, right?
Exactly. It's the same dimensionality as x because I'm creating a binary problem here, and Wi is the output of this thing. And as far as this binary problem is concerned, Wi is the weight vector that talks to that particular x. Which means we have k weight vectors. Did you have a question? We have k weight vectors. So we have, and if your dimensionality is d, we have d times k parameters here. And at this point, there's nothing to say whether that's good or bad. That's just an observation. Yes.
Can the reverse of this happen? Like, can there exist a weight where none of the weight vectors actually satisfy it?
Yes, it can. You mean the assumption, the primary assumption? Yes, and that will take us to all versus all. But before that, just a visualization. Let's say you're given 3 classes and you have some training data. The assumption of one versus all is each of these is linear. Each class is linearly separable from the union of all others. What you do is you create one binary data set for each class. So create for the blue inputs, you create a binary classification task which separates blue from everything else, and you learn a weight vector. And I'm going to call something like this w.x. I'll call it the score for that label. I'll create another, for the red data, I'll create another binary classification problem. For the green data, I'll create another binary classification problem. And prediction, so every label is separable from all the others. And so you can, in this case, so you can, basically at this point you can implement one versus all. Because you have black boxes that do binary classification. And you can, this uses that black box as that learning algorithm as a black box. Prediction, of course, is which of these labels has the highest score. Which of the points, effectively, the highest score. Score corresponds to distance from the hyperplane. Which hyperplane, so given a new point, which hyperplane is farthest from that point? That is the true label. Geometrically, that's what ends up happening. Yeah.
Can we not take the nearest neighbor?
What's the nearest neighbor here?
I mean, whichever other...
Nearest neighbors requires you to store the entire training set. And in general, that's not a great idea. There's another question. Yes?
I was going to say, this somewhat answers his problem of if none of them are positive, you can still assign it to the least negative.
Yes, the least negative. It's basically prediction is R max Wi transpose X. So instead of prediction looks like this. R max over I, Wi transpose X. Does anyone see a problem with this? One of you already did, but does anyone else see a problem with this?
So the weight part, maybe if you do normalize it, then maybe you can get like the higher value for the Wi transpose multiplied by X.
That's one problem. Actually, that's a good point. Normalization can kill one versus all. There's another fundamental, a more basic question.
I guess one concern is
are these, each of these data sets
Yep.
inseparable from the rest?
Is this assumption ever satisfied? So you could have data like this, right? So I can separate the blue from everything else. I can separate the red and the green. What about the center one? There is no line that separates the black boxes from all the other labels, all the other points. So one versus all will fail in data that looks like this. And upfront, there's no way of knowing if you, again, we cannot plot million dimensional data. So upfront, there's no way of knowing whether one versus all will fail or not. There was a wonderful paper, in fact, a thesis in about early 2000s by Ryan Rifkin, which talked about in defense of one versus all, where he tried out the one versus all algorithm on dozens of different data sets out in the wild. It turns out, surprisingly, it does pretty well. A well-tuned one versus all with well-tuned binary classifiers ends up doing pretty well, which is kind of a surprising fact. But in practice, I never use one versus all because the multi-class SVM is actually so much more easier to use. Yeah.
Wouldn't this case be something like it just wouldn't belong to any of the other ones, so you can sort of assume that?
How do you know it doesn't belong? Because if I take argmax, there will be something that argmax that maximizes that score, right?
It's before we were saying greater than 0, right?
No, we were never. We are training with greater.
one.
We're training with greater than 0. At prediction time, we are just using winner take all. Yep.
Would there be a possibility that now this like test example belong to nowhere? There are negatives.
Yeah, that it's possible, but it's not necessarily explored in the literature. Yeah. In the 4 minutes that are left, I'm going to talk about the other strategy for multi-class classification. But before that, just a summary of problems with one versus all. There's no theoretical justification. We said that the data is linearly separable label-wise. There are some calibration issues. You're training k binary classifiers independently and then stacking them into an argmax. Who said that the score produced by label 1 is in the same numeric range as the score produced by label 2? It's possible that label 1 produces scores in between, say, -1 to 1. Label 2, the weights for label 1 produces -1 to 1. The weight for label 2 produces scores in -18 to +18. So there is no normalization across labels. And again, for some mysterious reason, it just doesn't seem to happen. In theory, there's nothing that prevents it from happening. In practice, it doesn't show up too much. And it's not clear why. It might not always work, but like I said, occasionally, very often it does. The other alternative, I'm going to skip this because it's just something that you might want to know for a future. And I expect you to go over these slides anyway because I won't be talking about all strategies for multi-class anyway. But the other strategy is called all versus all. And it makes the rather more acceptable assumption that every pair of labels is linearly separable. Okay, what that means is in terms of picture, okay, I can't draw the picture for this, but for every pair of labels I and j, you create a binary classification task that says plus if label equals I, minus if label equals j. You throw away all the examples belonging to all other labels and you train a binary classifier. And you do this roughly order of k square times for all pairs of labels. So you get k square binary classifiers, each of which is d-dimensional. So you get in winner take all, in one versus all, we had k times d the weights overall. Here we have k square times d because we have k square classifiers. The other question is, how do you predict? Winner take all was a rather natural strategy. You pick the classifier, you pick the label that has the highest score. Here you have k square things, and every label is, there are k-1 classifiers that have something to say about that label. And prediction involves somehow pooling together the decisions of all these k-square classifiers into a single output. There is no clear idea of what's a good way of doing this. One answer is to basically vote. Every classifier gets a vote. Every classifier says, I like this label or I like this label, I or j. You create a counter for every label, you count how many votes each label gets and take the label that gets the maximum number of votes. That has some fundamental issues. It turns out there are some, you get into voting theory and stuff, and it doesn't always work. The other option is to set up a tournament. Think of every pair of labels as a game, every weight vector as being a game between two labels. Two labels play a game, the winner plays the winner of other two, and you set up this whole tournament, and it's like March Madness. And you get a label at the end. None of these things are necessarily theoretically well motivated. These things work sometimes.
Could you use something like AdaBoost to somehow deal with this data?
So multi-class AdaBoost is another bit of a complication, and we should talk about that offline. So I want to end with a question, which is, what are problems with this approach? And I already mentioned one. One of them is you store k-square parameters, k-square times d parameters. And it's possible that one label is represented, very poorly represented. And so each individual binary classification task can be very skewed. And finally, the prediction is rather ad hoc. I mean, voting or tournament or it could be something rather, it's not clear what's the good strategy for prediction. In any case, so let me wind up this story, and there's another version of the story called, another style of multi-class classification called error correcting codes, and you should take a look at it if you want. But the general idea of this decomposition method is you know how to do binary classification problems, binary classification, you take multi-class and you decompose it into a series of decisions, series of binary decisions, and throw in whichever binary classification algorithm you want at it, and somehow come up with a strategy to pull these decisions together. There is no global view of the output. There's nothing that says that the final output should be multi-class when you're learning. And if you decompose in a bad way, it turns out performance can be bad. Like I promised, at the end of the semester this time, I'll talk about more global strategies for multi-class classification. And these are strategies that will optimize some global measure of correctness. And they go back to this whole loss minimization style of work. I think I'm 2 minutes over time, so I'll let you go. If there are questions, I'm around. If not, just to remind you, there are no office hours.